Some stories sound so unbelievable. You almost scroll right past them. This was one of those stories. A wave of molasses. Honestly, my first thought was, there's no way that's real, but something about it stayed with me. So I started reading. Old newspaper reports, eyewitness accounts, court records, and then I found this photograph. I kept looking at it, trying to understand what had happened here. The street was gone. Buildings were destroyed. People were covered in something dark. And at first, I honestly thought it was mud. Then I read the caption. One word. Molasses. I actually read it twice, because nothing about it made sense. That's when I realized this wasn't just a strange story. It was a disaster that never should have happened. Boston, January 15th, 1919. It was a cold winter afternoon, just after 12:30. The North End was alive. Children were playing in the streets. Horses pulled heavy wagons through the narrow roads. Factory workers were heading back after lunch. Shop owners were serving customers. It felt like any other ordinary day, but if you looked above the rooftops, you would have seen something unusual. A giant steel tank, nearly 50 feet tall, holding more than 2 million gallons of molasses. People walked past it every single day. Most of them barely noticed it anymore. It had become part of the neighborhood, but not everyone trusted it. Some residents said the tank groaned at night. Others claimed they could hear the steel creaking. Children collected leaking molasses in small cans because the tank had been dripping for months. Instead of fixing the leaks, the company painted the tank brown, hoping no one would notice. Looking back, that may have been the first warning. Nobody knew that in less than an hour, Boston would witness one of the strangest disasters in American history. For just a moment, everything felt perfectly normal. People were talking, wagons rolled slowly through the streets, shop doors opened and closed. Children laughed, and then somebody heard it, a sharp metallic crack. One witness later said it sounded like a giant sheet of steel being torn apart. Then came another crack, and another. Within seconds, the entire neighborhood echoed with the sound of twisting metal. Some people froze, others looked up, but no one understood what they were hearing. Inside the tank, something catastrophic was happening. Warm molasses had recently been pumped inside. The pressure kept rising. Every steel plate, every rivet, was carrying more weight than it could handle. Then, the first section failed. One steel plate ripped away. The others followed almost instantly. There was no explosion, no fire, no warning siren, just the violent sound of an enormous steel tank ripping itself apart. And then, the wall disappeared. More than 2 million gallons of thick molasses burst into the streets. At first, people couldn't even understand what they were looking at. It wasn't water. It wasn't smoke. It wasn't mud. It was something nobody expected to see. And by the time they realized what it was already too late. At first, it didn't look fast. It looked impossible. A massive wall of dark brown molasses surged into Commercial Street. Then it began to accelerate. Witnesses later estimated the wave reached nearly 25 feet high and raced through the neighborhood at more than 30 miles an hour. It wasn't just sticky syrup. It carried steel beams, bricks, broken timber, pieces of the tank itself, Everything in its path became a weapon. Buildings collapsed, wagons were lifted off the ground, horses disappeared beneath the wave. Some people tried to run, others never had the chance. One survivor later said, "It felt less like a flood and more like being hit by a moving building. The force was overwhelming. Thick molasses filled mouths, noses, and lungs. Every attempt to move became harder. The colder it became, the thicker the molasses turned. People who escaped the first impact suddenly found themselves trapped. Streets that had been full of life only moments earlier had become a nightmare." When the wave finally stopped, the silence didn't last long. It was replaced by cries for help. At first, rescuers couldn't understand what they were walking into. The streets had disappeared. Everything was buried beneath a thick layer of molasses, mixed with bricks, shattered wood, twisted steel, and broken glass. Some victims were completely trapped. Others were only visible because one hand or part of a face remained above the surface. Pulling someone out was far more difficult than anyone expected. Every movement made the thick molasses grip tighter. Rescuers later said it felt almost like trying to pull someone out of quicksand. Within minutes, police officers, firefighters, doctors, and ordinary neighbors rushed toward Commercial Street. Sailors from the training ship USS Nantucket were among the first to arrive. They crossed the harbor and joined the rescue effort. They used ladders, wooden planks, ropes, and anything they could find to reach people without becoming trapped themselves. One rescue could take 20 or even 30 minutes. Not because the victims were far away, but because every inch had to be fought for. By the end of the day, 21 people had lost their lives. More than 150 were injured. But for many families, the hardest part was still to come. While most people were running away, others were running toward the disaster. One of the first places hit was Engine 31 firehouse. It stood only a short distance from the tank. Inside, firefighters were going about an ordinary afternoon. They had no warning, no alarm, no time to react. When the wave struck, it smashed into the firehouse with incredible force. Part of the building collapsed almost instantly. Bricks, timber, glass, and heavy equipment came crashing down. Several firefighters were trapped beneath the wreckage. Those who survived didn't stop to think about themselves. They immediately began searching for survivors, pulling people from the thick molasses. Often took longer than reaching them. Every step was exhausting. Every rescue became a battle against the weight of the syrup. Nearby police officers joined the effort. So did doctors, factory workers, neighbors, and sailors from the training ship USS Nantucket. Many had never met each other before that day. But for the next several hours nothing else mattered. They worked side by side, digging with their hands, lifting shattered beams, tying ropes around trapped victims, refusing to give up. Some rescuers collapsed from exhaustion, others returned again and again because they believed someone else might still be alive. Later, many of them would say they had never experienced anything like it. When I read the rescue reports, one thing stayed with me. None of these people knew how many victims were still trapped. They simply heard people calling for help and kept going. A few days after the disaster, newspapers were filled with numbers. 21 people had died, more than 150 were injured. But after reading the investigation reports, I realize those numbers don't tell the real story. One name kept appearing again and again: Martin Cloherty. Martin had just finished working the night shift. Like so many workers in Boston, he went home to get some sleep. He had no idea that only a few streets away, a steel tank was already beginning to fail. When the molasses hit the house, it burst through the walls and lifted his bed off the floor. Somehow, Martin survived. He even managed to pull one of his sisters to safety, but his mother and his younger brother never made it out. Another victim was 8-year-old Antonio Di Stasio. He was outside collecting firewood with his sister Maria. They heard the noise and turned around, but there was nowhere to run. Antonio survived with serious injuries. Maria did not. She became one of the youngest victims of the Great Molasses Flood. By the time the rescue operation was over, 21 people had lost their lives and more than 150 others had been injured. Every one of them had a family. Every one of them had plans for that day. And none of them expected an ordinary Wednesday afternoon to become the last day of their lives. The official investigation lasted for years. Engineers examined thousands of pages of technical documents, interviewed witnesses, and studied every piece of steel recovered from the wreckage. What they found was astonishing. The tank had been designed by Arthur Gell, a company treasurer with no formal engineering education. He wasn't a structural engineer, yet he approved the design of a tank that would hold more than 2 million gallons of molasses. The investigation showed that several steel plates were much thinner than they should have been. Some measured only about half the thickness recommended for a structure of that size. The rivets holding the plates together also became a major focus. Metallurgical tests found that many contained unusually high levels of manganese, making the steel harder but also much more brittle in cold weather. When investigators reconstructed the failure, they concluded that cracks had begun forming around the rivet holes long before the disaster. Residents had reported hearing the tank groan for months. Some described deep rumbling sounds as it expanded and contracted. Others noticed fresh leaks almost every week. Children from the neighborhood even brought buckets and cans to collect the molasses dripping from the seams. Instead of shutting the tank down, the company simply painted it dark brown. The fresh paint made the leaks much less noticeable from a distance. Investigators also discovered that the tank had never been filled with water before entering service. A hydrostatic pressure test would almost certainly have exposed the weaknesses before thousands of tons of molasses were stored inside. That test was never carried out. The final report concluded that the disaster wasn't caused by sabotage, bad luck, or an unexpected explosion. It was the result of poor design, weak materials, and a series of warnings that had been ignored. The legal battle didn't end in a matter of weeks or even months. It lasted almost 6 years. More than 100 witnesses testified. Engineers, metallurgists, survivors, and company officials all gave evidence in what became one of the most complex civil cases in American history. In 1925, the court finally reached its decision. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was found responsible for the disaster. The judge concluded that the tank had failed because of poor design and inadequate construction, not because of sabotage, which the company had claimed for years. In total, the company paid about $628,000 in compensation. Adjusted for today, that would equal many millions of dollars. But the most important consequence couldn't be measured in money. The Boston Molasses flood changed the way large structures were built across the United States. Before this case, many industrial projects could move forward with very little independent oversight. Afterward, cities began requiring detailed engineering calculations, certified drawings, and official inspections before large tanks and similar structures could be approved. Those requirements may seem ordinary today, but they exist because earlier disasters exposed what could happen when safety was treated as an afterthought. Today, nothing remains of the enormous steel tank. The neighborhood has completely changed. Families walk the same streets where rescue crews once searched through twisted steel and frozen molasses. There is now a small memorial marking the location of the disaster. And there is one final detail that has become part of Boston folklore. Some residents still say that on very hot summer days, they can smell molasses in the North End. There is no scientific evidence proving that claim. It is probably a story passed from one generation to the next. But perhaps that is exactly how history survives. Not only in photographs or court records, but in the memories that people choose to keep alive. More than 100 years have passed since the Great Molasses Flood, yet it remains one of the strangest industrial disasters ever recorded. Not because it involved molasses, but because almost every warning sign appeared long before the tank finally failed, and that may be the most important lesson this story leaves behind. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy forgotten stories from history, I'd be glad to see you again in the next documentary.